Eowyn would have done nothing, even if she had got a clean shot in, if it weren't for Merry's blade breaking that spell.
These are for you. Keep them close. Stay here.
All right. There are your swords, Hobbit says. Here's your run-of-the-mill, large, long daggers, essentially. And use these in the future. Now, that is completely different from the story of how they actually get to swords in this chapter. And so Fog on the Barrow-downs, right? That's the chapter's name, Fog on the Barrow-downs.
Correct.
And so when I saw this in the films, I'm like, oh, that's right. That's how they get the swords here, because I'd forgotten. Like they jumped so far forward that all of a sudden they need swords, and this is where they got them from. Okay, so but before we jump into what the Barrow-downs are and some more details on that, I want to read these couple quotes from Peter Jackson, where he starts talking about their choices to remove things like Bombadil, and he mentions the Barrow-downs as well. So here's what he said. This is from his book, Peter Jackson, A Filmmaker's Journey, which he did with Brian Sibley, who has also done a bunch of, I believe he also did the radio drama, the BBC radio drama, and he also did some of the behind-the-scenes books, and he did the Fall of Numenor book too. I believe he put that together. So he's well versed in all things Middle-earth, and he helped Peter Jackson put this book together, Peter Jackson, A Filmmaker's Journey. Here's what Peter Jackson said. Once you start going to the next level of detail below the main story points, that's when you run up against the hard decisions, which is basically a case of, we can't include everything, so what's our strategy? What do we want to focus on? You think beyond what your favorite bits are, and you look at it in greater terms. Let me start over. You think beyond what your favorite bits are, and you look at it in terms of a greater strategy, which in our case was really keeping a relationship between Frodo and the ring, keeping the events totally focused on the forward movement of the journey. This really explains to some degree why Tom Bombadil, Old Man Willow, and the Barrow-wights aren't there, because once Frodo left Hobbiton in the movie, we wanted everything at that point to point to his advance his journey to Rivendell and ultimately to Mordor. So, right, they had to always think like, okay, we're getting to Mordor. What advances that journey forward? And they felt that Bombadil, Old Man Willow, and the Barrow-wights didn't do that. Now, in addition to that, he also said this about the Hobbit's journey from Hobbiton to Bree. This is from the same book. The cinematic coverage of the Hobbit's journey to Bree was done in such a way that when you cut back to these four hobbits scurrying through the trees and peering at the Bree gates, we figured that they could have seen Tom spend a couple of days at his house and had their experience on the Barrow-downs. There's nothing in the movie that says that those things didn't happen. We didn't eradicate Tom Bombadil from the mythology. It was simply that in the movie, we chose to show selected aspects of the journey. So,
so that's cope. That's cope, because mild cope, because that's clearly not true with regard to the weapons that are received, which is why you did the clip that you did.
Yeah.
So in other words, they wouldn't have needed swords from Aragorn if they had arrived at. See, what's interesting is if you really intended that, they would have arrived in Bree and they would have had swords on their hips, right? They also wouldn't have had the same clothes. But anyway,
that's true.
You wouldn't have needed the Aragorn scene giving them blades, but clearly the story was otherwise. But anyway, back to the main point. Aside from the mild cope in that statement, the main point I can see totally from a filmmaker's perspective and a director's perspective. Right? He says we have an arc to do. It's getting Frodo to Mordor. We simply do not have the time to cover everything. So when you ask yourself what has to be cut, it's going to be the stuff that doesn't get us directly to Mordor. And it is true that the events in the Crick Hollow and the events in the Old Forest and the events at Tom Bombadil's house and the events in the Barrow-downs contribute nothing to getting Frodo to Mordor. I mean, there's a geographic space that they cover, but you can just say that they traveled there between Hobbiton and Bree. And so you got these four aspects. They don't actually directly, they are kind of a side story. They don't actually directly get Frodo there. So I get that from a filmmaker's perspective, but that is why the books are so much better, because you get the wider, fuller, deeper, richer picture of Tolkien's world that you get to enjoy. And frankly, also, this is Tolkien's first foray into like what I would consider real horror. Is in the Barrow-downs, so he has that literary shift sometimes in his work where he's writing horror. He does it in Shelob's Lair, and in the Barrow-down we have the exact same situation. Like it's straight out of like the scene that Frodo sees in the Barrow under the ground is straight out of a horror movie. It's like it's impressive.
And I will say, Andy Serkis's reading of this chapter is great. Like the voice that he gives to the Barrow-wight is actually really creepy and well done. Because he has such a nice timbre to his voice, especially when he goes low and he gets the air into it. So nice. I really like the way that he did the Barrow-wight. Right, it was frightening.
Definitely gonna have to check it.
It's worth listening to.
So maybe we should cover the basics of what happens in the Barrow-downs just to remind people.
And let's talk about what the Barrow is first, too. Okay. Because the hobbits don't really know either. And even coming out of it in the end, it's hard for us to know what it is without like rereading the whole section where Tom's explaining, but not like in historical terms of what those are. So what are the Barrows?
Okay.
Do you want to take it?
No. You. I know you have a reference for this part, and I'll read what the text actually says in the Fellowship of the Ring. But go ahead.
Okay. So So the Barrows, and this is something that I'd forgotten actually until I started looking at this. I'm like, they were actually built. So a barrow officially means a prehistoric grave mound. And that's what a barrow is. A down is essentially a small hill, a small rolling hill. So a prehistoric grave mound that is actually bigger than just a grave mound. It's actually more of a hill. That's kind of what a barrow-down means. And so these were graves. One, in the first stage, the ancestors of the Edain, the Númenóreans, lived there and constructed these barrows as graves for their leaders or for their people. I don't think it ever specifies exactly who is in there at that point, because once we get to this third age where Frodo's there and we learn some more about it, it's actually in the second age in where after the kingdom, Arnor is split up into Cardolan. Michael and I were fighting about which way to pronounce that. Cardolan. Arthedain, Ruadain,
Cardolan, and Rhudaur.
Rhudaur. Okay, so I never remember those names. Those was always rough for me. So those are split up. So for them, the barrow that they're in is actually a second age barrow of the last prince of Cardolan, I believe is what is explained. So barrows, that's why it's important. Now the wight, you might think like, oh, this is the ghost of the prince of Cardolan. No. It is not the ghost. The Barrow-wights were released by the Witch King of Angmar in the Angmar Wars and taken there to essentially haunt the Barrow-downs, to haunt those places.
Right. After Cardolan was defeated, the Witch King, as a kind of act of revenge, sends these spirits, these Barrow-wights, to inhabit bodies of some kind, which is what spirits do. We ran into that in the Silmarillion quite a few times. Evil spirits that come in and infest whatever. Wolves, then that makes them werewolves. Bats, that makes them vampires. There's the spirits that assaulted the moon when the moon and the sun came out. There's wights and wraiths that inhabit bodies. So
and Tolkien actually, this is in Return of the Shadow, chapter 6 on Tom Bombadil again. Tolkien makes the point that he actually has this question written that, are Black Riders actually horsed Barrow-wights? So at the point that he started writing this, he was thinking like maybe they're the same thing, because to him there was the relationship between the Witch King of Angmar releasing the wights into the Barrow-downs. Although I don't know if he'd even written that at that point. It's hard to know how much he's retconning and how much he's creating on the fly and how much was already there when he's writing this. So anyway,
what I found to be hilarious and cool was that the Barrow-wight, when Frodo wakes up and the other hobbits are asleep still under some spell, and Frodo is the only one awake, and he has to face this Barrow-wight who's speaking to him, but he can't see. The Barrow-wight begins an incantation, but it's a song of sorts, because of course it is, because this is Tolkien, and everyone, including the wraiths, sing. So the song is not a song that a Cardolan prince would sing. This is a song of a creature of evil, who's completely dedicated to the Dark Lord Morgoth and Sauron. He said the song is, or the incantation as it's called, but it's written in verse form. Cold be hand and heart and bone, and cold be sleep under stone. Never more to wake on stony bed, never till the sun fails and the moon is dead. I found that cool because the wraiths, these evil spirits, they hate the moon and the sun because they assaulted it in the first age under Morgoth. Mm-hmm. In the black wind, the stars shall die, and still on gold here let them lie, till the dark Lord lifts his hand over dead sea and withered land. So here's a creature completely committed to destruction, nihilism, and serving the Dark Lord. He is defeated when Frodo goes after a dead hand, walking across in very It style across the ground towards the throats of his companions. Frodo takes a sword at hand and smashes it against the hand and causes a snarl, and all the lights go dark. And then Frodo remembers to call out to Tom Bombadil, and Tom Bombadil hears him and comes. And Tom Bombadil opens the grave and drives out the wights, which in a very Tom Bombadil fashion. So he has all of his no less than 5 different songs that he used over the next few pages that he sings with regard to the, basically driving out the wights and freeing the hobbits and then lifting their spirits. One of the more interesting things is when Merry wakes up, he references the history that you referenced, but he does it as someone who he has a dream from one of the men of Cardolan. So what that tells you is that it isn't just about these evil spirits that have come to inhabit the grave, but somehow the spirit of the dead man is there too, because he says, what in the name of wonder began Merry, feeling the golden circlet that had slipped over one eye? Because, of course, the Barrow-wight dresses them up in the clothing of the dead. Then he stopped, and a shadow came over his face, and he closed his eyes. Of course, I remember, he said. The men of Carn Dûm came on us at night, and we were worsted. Ah, the spear in my heart. He clutched at his breast. No, he said, opening his eyes. What am I saying? I've been dreaming. Where did you get to, Frodo? So clearly he had the dream of probably the man whose circlet he was wearing, which was a nobleman, maybe the prince himself of Cardolan, that was killed by being stabbed through the heart by a spear. The Carn Dûm is the capital of Angmar, the Witch King's realm, which waged war for centuries against the kingdoms of Arnor, the 3 kingdoms that you mentioned, Arthedain, Rhudaur, and Cardolan. And so he's got this dream from them. And then Tom Bombadil says a couple things that are interesting, and this is the key connector with the rest of the story. That we're gonna come back to. Tom, it wasn't Aragorn giving them a bunch of dirty swords on Weathertop. It was Tom Bombadil giving them these swords from the Barrow, the treasures of the Barrow. And he says 2 things. First, he chooses a brooch for himself, which is interesting because Tom Bombadil, we tend to think of these kinds of spirits maybe as like a spirit like Tom, whatever he is, shouldn't care that much about treasure, and he doesn't. He just leaves it to that. But he picks a single brooch out for a goldberry, actually. And he says, here's a pretty toy for Tom and for his lady. Fair was she who long ago wore this on her shoulder. Goldberry shall wear it now, and we will not forget her. So he's paying homage to the lady of Cardolan that the brooch belonged to by carrying it back to Goldberry and having Goldberry wear it, which is very cool, very medieval. And then he says, for each of the hobbits, he chose a dagger, long, leaf-shaped, and keen, of marvelous workmanship, damasked with serpent forms in red and gold. They gleamed as he drew them from their black sheaths, wrought of some strange metal, light and strong and set with many fiery stones. Whether by some virtue in these sheaths or because of the spell that lay on the mound, blades seem untouched by time, unrusted, sharp, glittering in the sun. So different from those, okay? There's some dirty swords, and these things are glittering and worked in red and gold, and the metal, he calls out that the metal itself of the blades, the hobbits would know what iron and steel and bronze and those other things are. So it's not any of that. So it's some other metal that clearly the men of Cardolan were able to work. And it has a special purpose, but we'll find that out later. And their blades were leaf shaped. The one leaf shaped blade in the movie is Sting, has a leaf shaped blade. So when I imagine them, I imagine fancier Sting because of the red and gold and the fiery stones. Like they're jeweled. These are the weapons of noblemen, and so it's pretty cool. But there's more to it than that. So
I wonder if in the films, I mean, I do know that they knew the Lord of the Rings well, and
yes,
this has got to be one of those moments where they're like, guys, how are we going to do this? How are we going to get them their swords? Because they're important swords. And I bet somebody was like, forget it. Just Aragorn's got them. He's going to throw them on the ground. They're going to grab them. We can't do more than that. We can't have a whole backstory to the swords anymore.
And they had to do that, right? Because the hobbits left the Shire and they didn't have any weapons. And that's been the whole thing. The hobbits' weapons are not a thing that hobbits carry around normally. They don't need them in the Shire. And so we know that the hobbits don't have weapons, and then they're about to use the weapons and brandish them, or at least brandish them on Weathertop against the Nazgul. So they need to get them something. They need to show how they got them somehow, and that's how they chose to do it. Sadly,
so Tom Bombadil, he goes in, he comes out with all the stuff, he gets them their swords. Now, Michael, why is that important? Why are these swords more important than the swords given by Aragorn to the hobbits in the films?
Okay, so these swords are, and this is the key, this is the master storytelling thing. And let me just say, for the record, for this whole topic, this is not obviously a major storytelling point. This is just one of the many details that gives the richness to Tolkien's story, that sets it apart and makes it a classic. This kind of thing that is why Tolkien is so well loved. So these blades are barely mentioned. They are mentioned in passing, but nothing special about them a couple times throughout the rest of the books, until the Return of the King, until a climactic moment. And that climactic moment is, of course, the scene that we've already discussed as well in other podcasts for different reasons. But that is the scene of the confrontation, first between the Witch King of Angmar and Theoden. And so the Witch King's fell beast kills Theoden's horse and crushes Theoden. And then he's about to feast on him, and Éowyn reveals herself, and then we get the prophecy, and the Witch King laughs at her, and Éowyn faces up to him. Unlike anyone else around, she and Merry are the only ones that face up to him, and of course they defeat him. But how they defeat him is really interesting in light of the Barrow-downs. So I don't know.
Here's the clip from the films that you're talking about. Very short clip, but important. So that clip right there, where he is doing that.
There he is. There's our screenshot. So he's stabbing his blade into the back of the knee of the Witch King. Now, I love it because they did the visuals right for this. You even have like this white light coming out, which actually might even be appropriate given what we then find out from the book. So in the movie, it's just Merry stabs him in the knee. He goes down. He's vulnerable. Éowyn stabs him in the face, and the Witch King's defeated. But in the book, it makes it clear that this is a moment where there is something else happening, and it's because of the blade that they got in the Barrow-downs. And so after this scene, after the fall of the Witch King, and after Éowyn when they think she's dead, she's herself fallen. Éomer comes up. Éomer then sees the death of the king. He's now the king. Then he leaves, and Meriadoc, as he is often called in noble moments, Tolkien switches from Merry to Meriadoc. This is from the Battle of Pelennor Fields chapter, and so Éomer leaves, and he leaves with this awesome, he over the field rang his clear voice calling, "Death, ride to ruin in the world's ending." So the Rohirrim go off on this death charge to basically keep attacking until they die, they think. And so they sweep away. And still Meriadoc the Hobbit stood there blinking through his tears, and no one spoke to him. Indeed, none seemed to heed him. He brushed away the tears and stooped to pick up the green shield that Eowyn had given him, and he slung it on his back. Then he looked for his sword that he had let fall, for even as he struck his blow, his arm was numbed, and now he could only use his left hand. And behold, there lay his weapon, but the blade was smoking like a dry branch that has been thrust into a fire, and as he watched it, it writhed and withered and was consumed. So passed the sword of the Barrow-downs, work of Westernesse, but glad would he have been to know its fate who wrought it slowly, long ago in the North Kingdom, when the Dunedain were young, and chief among their foes was the dread realm of Angmar and its sorcerer king. No other blade, not though mightier hands had wielded it, would have dealt that foe a wound so bitter, cleaving the undead's flesh, breaking the spell that knit his unseen sinews to his will. So, in one sentence, Tolkien explains how awesome this blade is, which is that it was for this very purpose, to cleave undead flesh and break the spell that knit their sinews to their will. So we know that wraiths have a physical form, even though you can't see it, but they have this unseen flesh because they're a spirit that has inhabited this body corpse thing. And these blades of Westernesse were made to break that spell. Eowyn would have done nothing even if she had got a clean shot in, if it weren't for Merry's blade breaking that spell. And so, which is why the Witch King is one of the many reasons the Witch King is so confident, because basically he has this protection by his nature. His unnature, but he has this protection, which this one blade just so happened to be on the battlefield at the right time in the hands of a warrior that no one paid attention to, who could then deal that blow. So fantastic ending to the prophecy of Glorfindel, the ancient prophecy of Glorfindel about not by hand of man will he be slain.
I love in the books in this part that how the patchwork of the histories of Middle Earth that you're given glimpses of through these other parts, whether it's the Witch King now was the Witch King then, you don't really realize that necessarily that's what they're talking about until you read it a second or third time. Like it's not obvious, it's not clear, because you don't connect the Barrow-wights that happened so early in the book to his death at the end readily. It's not something you that is obvious, and that's why when these things are stitched together, it makes the story and the world so much greater. And the idea of eucatastrophe, even in that they needed to get to the Barrow-wights to defeat, like they needed to have this Tom Bombadil thing. They needed to be rescued by him in a way. Tom Bombadil had a hand in defeating Sauron, ultimately by defeating the Witch King of Angmar. And
right.
I love that depth, and you do lose some of that in the films, and it is sad, especially all about, like you mentioned, the importance of that sword and how it was wrought especially for the purpose of destroying the wraiths, to unknit the sinews of flesh. So that's the big thing we lose. The Tom Bombadil episode, you don't lose that kind of an important piece of hardware, piece of the story.
Yep. Now, ultimately, is it catastrophic to the story to remove that? And we'll answer that as we go through our questions.
All right. So let's do that. Let's get through our questions. The first of which is it lore friendly? Is it lore friendly to remove
the Barrow-downs?
The Barrow-downs. I am going to say no. It is not lore friendly. I think it's an important piece of lore, and just throwing out Billy Bob's Bree swords down at the feet of the hobbits is a loss. So I feel like no, it's not lore friendly to completely remove the Barrow-downs from the films.
Okay, I'm going to take the same tack to answer the question that as I do with all the other ones where Peter Jackson just removes an entire section. And when I answer the question, not just is it lore friendly in the sense that it removes lore, because all of this, every removal removes lore, but is it critical to the story, or in some way where they've removed something? And I have to actually stand on it's actually okay that he does this. Even though I love what I just read, I actually think it's, from the definition of removal, it's not lore unfriendly, and so that suffices for this. So I'm going to go with yes. It is actually lore friendly because of how minor that detail is. Cool, rich, and wonderful as it is, nevertheless, it is a minor detail, and it does not make it unfriendly to the lore to remove that piece.
So you're saying being able to kill the Witch King of Angmar with the proper hardware is completely lore friendly. Like if you remove that, it's totally fine.
No, it's not completely. It's not completely. I just can't swing
on a
between
scale.
two pendulums.
I get you.
It just doesn't cross the line of being detrimental to the lore enough to make it lore unfriendly. So
that pendulum in my head, there's this big magnet on the no side that always somehow pulls that pendulum toward it more so than perhaps it does for you. So we split on that one. It is lore friendly. Is it lore friendly? Michael says yes. I say no. So let's get to the next question. Does the change make for better cinema? This is hard. Michael, what do you think?
Yes, I think yes, for the same reason as we said last week, and that is that it makes for better cinema because it's a big story, a big chunk, including Tom Bombadil and a bunch of stuff from Tom Bombadil. Which, if you're going to cut one piece, which you already talked about Tom Bombadil, it doesn't actually, except for the one detail that we lovingly pointed out because we like it so much, it doesn't actually make for better cinema to include what would have had to have been like a whole 20 minutes extra of the movie in order to accurately show their journey through the Barrow-downs, them falling asleep on the down, them waking up in the Barrow.
But what about them running around naked on the grassy hill of the Barrow-down?
They're running around without clothes. Yeah, they would have had the hard R rating if they had gone with the full text.
I will say the creepiness of this episode, I think, is missed. There's you get some of the creepy stuff. It's a little bit more on the schlock horror, particularly when you get the extended edition of the Paths of the Dead with the giant mound of skulls that comes tumbling out of all the doorways and windows of the interior mausoleum, it seems like. But does it, I might surprise you. Yes, I think it does make for better cinema. You could, like you said, in this film, adding all that would have been really difficult, and trying to explain, okay, so you need the sword that's made from 4,000 years ago in order to actually destroy you can't explain all that. And then
what are you going to do about how they escape from the Barrow? Because you can't. You took out Tom Bombadil, so you can't put this.
I know.
Tom Bombadil.
Arwen could have come and helped them escape.
Well, you will find, in my opinion, when it comes to the removal of Glorfindel, is different from my opinion about the removal of the Barrow-downs.
Yes. Okay. All right. Okay. Cool. So how much do you like the change? Okay. So this is an emotional reaction to me. The midpoint is 3. That's exactly where I am in my average. Michael is slightly above that at 3.2 on a scale of 1 to 5. So 1 is the lowest we can give it. I understand the change, but I still don't like the change. I understand. Does that make sense? I understand why it needed to be done, but I don't like it because it removes that texture of Middle Earth that makes it so wonderful to wrap around you, that history is in there, right? It just, you lose some of that. So I'm going to go a little bit lower than 3. I'm going to go 2.7. 2.7. I think that's where I'm going to land. 2.7. Michael, what do you think?
So last week we talked about whether we liked the change of them removing Tom Bombadil, and we both scored very high. We liked them removing him. My reason for that, and I think you somewhat agreed with me, was they would have done a terrible job if they tried to put him in. So I'm really glad they left him out for that reason. Would they have done a terrible job if they had put in the Barrow-downs? I don't think so. I think they could have pulled off the Barrow-downs as long as they don't do the Mountain of Skulls. That schlocky element, which comes from Jackson's previous cinematic history, film history, I think is silly. But there are other places, parts of Shelob's Lair, parts of Mordor, other darker elements that really do. Even the Nazgul themselves, which I think.
That's the point.
He does a good job. So I think they could have pulled it off. So I'm not going to say I like the change for that reason. Do I like the change in general? Of course not. But it's so it is so kind of necessary for a cinema to, if you're removing Bombadil, it would have, if they had put it in and not had Bombadil, it would have been so disjointed that they would have had to come up with some other weird random, ending to that story. It would have changed it. So I'm just going to flat this one. I'm going to go 3.0 because I'm not confident in their ability to do it really well, and I miss out the fact that we don't have the blades of Western-S. But on the other hand, if they had tried to do it, I think it would have been terrible. Just not as bad as Tom Bombadil.